The airlock hissed shut with a metallic clang, sealing Alex Carter and Elena Vasquez in a cocoon of silence aboard the Aurora Vanguard. The sound reverberated briefly in the cramped chamber before fading, leaving only the rhythmic beeping of the life support system, a steady, mechanical pulse that underscored their fragile existence. Beyond the observation window, a reinforced pane of triple-layered glass. The stars burned cold and distant, their light piercing the infinite black with an unyielding indifference. Inside, however, within the confines of the spacecraft's narrow corridors and sterile walls, a different kind of heat radiated between them, raw and electric, born of months of isolation and unspoken longing. Elena's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as Alex's hands traced the curve of her spine, his fingers pressing into the thin fabric of her jumpsuit. The material was a marvel of engineering, lightweight, breathable, designed to regulate temperature and protect against the harshness of space. But it was never meant for this, not for the way his touch ignited a fire beneath her skin, a blaze that spread with every deliberate movement, overwhelming the discipline they'd both been trained to maintain. She arched into him, her body trembling with a need that had simmered for 9 months, ever since the catastrophic failure of the Eclipton drive had stranded them in this drifting tomb. Her suit clung to her frame, outlining the taut lines of muscle honed by years of training, now quivering under his grasp. "Alex," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the ship's systems, a faint vibration that pulsed through the walls, the floor, the very air they breathed. Her dark hair, cropped short for practicality, brushed against his jaw as she spoke, her breath warm against his skin. He didn't respond with words. Instead, his lips found hers, hungry and demanding, crashing into her with a force that spoke of desperation and defiance. The kiss was a collision of longing and fear, a tangle of tongues and teeth that stripped away the veneer of control they'd worn like armor. They were astronauts, elite operatives trained at XAI's rigorous facilities for precision, resilience, and unshakable composure under pressure. They'd aced simulations of hull breaches, navigation failures, and psychological stress tests, their minds sharpened to razor edges. But here in this moment, all that training melted away, dissolved by the heat of their proximity and the weight of their shared doom. They were no longer Commander Vasquez and Engineer Carter, just two people clinging to each other in the vast, uncaring emptiness of space. Elena's hands fumbled with the clasps of his suit, her fingers trembling as they navigated the intricate network of Velcro strips and magnetic seals. The suit was a second skin, gray and utilitarian, its surface scuffed from months of repairs and wear, patched in places with strips of thermal tape. She cursed under her breath as a clasp snagged, her nails scraping against the metal edge, but Alex's hands joined hers, his movements urgent and sure. His breath was hot against her neck, a staccato rhythm that matched the pounding of her pulse. Together, they worked, the last clasp free, the fabric parting with a soft rasp, and he yanked it down his shoulders, exposing the sweat-damp undershirt beneath. He pulled her closer, his body pressing against hers with a force that pinned her against the cool metal wall of the observation deck. The contrast was jarring, the frigid bite of the ship's interior against her back, the searing heat of his chest against hers, skin meeting skin where their suits gaped open. They had done this before, countless times over the past 9 months since the mission went awry. It had started as a spark, an accidental brush of hands in the galley, a shared glance in the command module, igniting a fire they couldn't extinguish. At first they'd resisted, clinging to professionalism, but the isolation had eroded their defenses, and the sex had become a lifeline, a way to drown out the fear and loneliness. They'd taken each other in every corner of the ship, the crew quarters, the maintenance shafts, even the medbay's narrow cot, each encounter a desperate grasp at something human amidst the sterile machinery. But this time felt different. There was a desperation in their movements, a frantic edge that hadn't been there before, as if they both sensed the end drawing near. The ship's systems were failing, the oxygen recyclers stuttering, the power flickering, and their fragile bubble of existence teetered on the brink of collapse. Their suits hit the floor in a tangle of fabric, pooling around their ankles as they shed the last barriers between them. Alex's hands roamed her body, calloused fingers mapping the familiar terrain of her hips, her waist, the small of her back, as if committing her to memory. Elena's nails dug into his shoulders, leaving faint crescents on his skin, her breath hitching as he pressed himself closer. The air was cool, tinged with the faint metallic tang of recycled oxygen, but their bodies radiated heat, slick with sweat that beaded and rolled down their skin. The beeping of the life support system faded into the background, drowned by the sound of their gasps, their murmured names, the rustle of movement against the unyielding metal wall. It was fierce, almost violent, a release of everything they'd buried, the terror of their predicament, the grief for their lost crewmates, the gnawing dread of what lay ahead. When it was over, they collapsed together, their bodies tangled in a heap on the observation deck's floor. The cold metal pressed against their skin, a stark reminder of their surroundings, but they clung to each other, slick with sweat and panting in the dim light. The stars outside the window burned on, their icy glow filtering through the glass, casting faint shadows across their entwined forms. They seemed to mock them, those distant pinpricks of light, a reminder of how small and insignificant they were in the grand, indifferent sweep of the universe. Decays. Elena rested her head on Alex's chest, her ear pressed to the steady thud of his heartbeat, a rhythm that grounded her, a proof of life in the silence. Her hair was damp, sticking to her forehead, and her breath slowed as she traced idle patterns on his skin with her fingertips. "Alex," she said again, her voice soft but laced with something he couldn't quite place, resignation perhaps, or a quiet sorrow that cut deeper than words. Her dark eyes flicked up to meet his, searching, but he had no answer to give. He couldn't respond. The weight of their situation pressed down on him, a heavy, unyielding burden that squeezed the air from his lungs. They were stranded, alone in the void, the Aurora Vanguard a crippled shell drifting far from any hope of rescue. The Eclipton Drive, their ticket to the stars, was a melted ruin, its failure 9 months ago on June 20, 2024, claiming 4 of their crew in a flash of light and leaving them adrift. They'd fought to survive, rationing supplies, repairing what they could, but the end was inevitable. No amount of passion, no matter how fierce, could change that. Alex tightened his arm around her, his jaw clenching as he stared at the stars, their cold beauty a cruel mirror to the warmth fading between them. The ship's hum was a death knell, counting down their final moments, and he held her closer, as if he could shield her from the void that waited to claim them both. 9 months earlier, they had been part of a team of 6 astronauts meticulously selected and trained for a groundbreaking mission. Their task was to test a revolutionary propulsion system, a technological marvel that promised to redefine humanity's reach into the cosmos. The system, dubbed the Eclipton Drive, was the culmination of decades of research by XAA's brightest engineers. It was designed to bend the laws of physics, compressing space-time to propel the ship faster and farther than any vessel before it. Success would mean interstellar travel within a human lifetime. Failure was unthinkable, until it happened. The crew had launched from Earth, aboard the Aurora Vanguard, a sleek, state-of-the-art spacecraft built to withstand the rigors of deep space. The team consisted of Commander Elena Vasquez, a steely-eyed veteran with a knack for keeping chaos at bay, Dr. Liam Carter, the mission's propulsion expert and the intellectual heart of the project, Navigator Priya Sharma, whose precision with star charts was unmatched, Engineer Marcus Tate, a gruff but brilliant mechanic, Biologist Dr. Aisha Okaya, tasked with monitoring the crew's health, and Communications Specialist Julian Reyes, the group's optimist, always quick with a joke to lighten the mood. Together they were a tight-knit unit, handpicked not just for their skills but for their ability to endure the psychological strain of isolation. The mission had begun with meticulous preparation. For weeks, they orbited Earth, running simulations and triple-checking every component of the Eclipton Drive. The day of the test arrived, June 20, 2024, a date etched into their mind. The crew gathered in the command module, a sterile, white-walled room lined with glowing panels and humming machinery. Elena stood at the helm, her voice steady as she gave the order to engage the drive. Liam, seated at the propulsion console, initiated the sequence, his fingers trembling slightly with anticipation. The rest of the crew braced themselves, their eyes flickering between the screens and the reinforced viewport that offered a glimpse of the infinite black beyond. The activation was supposed to be seamless. The drive would hum to life, a low vibration building to a crescendo as it warped space around the ship, propelling them toward a predetermined point near Mars in a fraction of the time it would take conventional engines. Instead, something went catastrophically wrong. The hum became a roar, the lights flickered, and then a blinding flash of light engulfed them. It was as if the universe itself had fractured. The crew's screams were swallowed by the chaos, their bodies pinned to their seats by an unseen force, then silence. When Elena and Liam regained consciousness, they were alone. The command module was eerily quiet, save for the faint hiss of escaping air and the sporadic crackle of failing electronics. The other four, Priya, Marcus, Aisha, and Julian, were gone. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, just empty seats and abandoned stations. The viewport showed nothing but the endless void, stars twinkling mockingly in the distance. The ship's logs were corrupted, offering no explanation for the disappearance or the malfunction. The Eclipton drive, once a beacon of hope, was now a twisted wreck, its core melted into a useless slab of metal. At first, survival instinct kicked in. Elena, ever the leader, took stock of their situation. The Aurora Vanguard was drifting, its trajectory unknown. Life support systems were operational, but degraded. Oxygen recyclers stuttering, water purifiers sluggish, the propulsion system was beyond repair, its delicate components fused into a nightmarish sculpture of failure. Liam, the only one who truly understood the drive's inner workings, spent hours poring over diagnostics, his face illuminated by the dim glow of a flickering tablet. "It's gone," he said, finally, his voice hollow. "The core overloaded. We're not getting home." Elena refused to accept it. She rallied Liam, and together they tore into the ship's systems, searching for a workaround. They crawled through maintenance shafts, their hands blackened with grease, rewiring circuits and patching leaks. They scavenged parts from non-essential systems, the entertainment console, the lab's microscopes, hoping to cobble together a miracle. But the damage was too extensive. The ship was a dying organism, and they were its last, desperate cells. Days bled into weeks. They rationed their food, protein bars, and dehydrated meals, measuring each bite with surgical precision. Water was sipped, not gulped, recycled through filters that groaned with every cycle. Sleep came in fits. Haunted by dreams of Earth. Elena's daughter laughing in a sunlit park. Liam's cluttered lab filled with books and coffee mugs. The silence of the ship was oppressive, broken only by the occasional clank of metal or the soft buzz of a failing relay. They spoke less, their conversations reduced to curt updates on dwindling supplies or futile repair attempts. The isolation gnawed at them. Elena, once a pillar of strength, began to falter. Her hands shook as she adjusted the oxygen levels, her mind replaying the moment of the flash. Had she missed something? Liam withdrew into himself, his once sharp intellect dulled by despair. He spent hours staring at the ruined drive, muttering equations under his breath, as if they could summon a solution from the void. The ship became a prison, its sterile walls closing in, its artificial gravity a cruel mimicry of the world they'd lost. And yet, amidst the desolation, something unexpected emerged. It began one night, March 15, 2025, by their reckoning 9 months into their exile. They were in the narrow corridor connecting the command module to the crew quarters, a cramped passage lined with conduits and flickering lights. Elena was carrying a toolkit, Liam a spare oxygen canister. Their shoulders brushed as they passed. A fleeting contact that sent a jolt through them both. They froze, eyes locking in the dimness. Neither spoke, but the air thickened with unspoken tension. It was a touch so mundane, so accidental, yet it ignited something buried deep within them. For months, they'd suppressed every emotion but survival. Fear, grief, rage, locking them away behind a facade of professionalism. But that brush of skin cracked the dam. Elena's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the toolkit. Liam's gaze lingered, his exhaustion giving way to a flicker of something primal. They stepped back, retreating to their tasks, but the spark refused to fade. The next day, it happened again. They were in the galley, a small space with a fold-out table and a dwindling stash of rations. Liam reached for a water pouch just as Elena did, their hands colliding. This time, neither pulled away. Their fingers lingered, tracing the contours of calluses and scars earned over months of labor. The air grew heavy, charged with a current neither could name. Elena's voice was a whisper, "We shouldn't." Liam's response was a shaky nod, but his hand didn't move. They fought it. They were astronauts, trained to master their impulses, to thrive under pressure. Elena reminded herself of her duty, of the mission that still clung to her like a ghost. Liam clung to logic, calculating the risks of distraction in their fragile state, but the ship's emptiness mocked their restraint. The void outside mirrored the one within, stripping away the layers of discipline until only raw need remained. Every glance, every accidental touch, fueled the fire. The tension built over days, a slow burn that left them restless, sleepless, teetering on the edge. On March 18, they broke. It was late. The ship's lights dimmed to conserve power. They were in the command module, reviewing a useless star chart for the 100th time. Elena stood too close, her shoulder brushing Liam's. He turned, and before either could think, their lips met. It was clumsy, desperate, a collision of pent-up longing. They stumbled back, hands grasping at uniforms, tearing at Velcro and zippers. The sex was fierce, almost violent, a release of everything they'd buried. The terror of death, the ache of loss, the suffocating loneliness. They moved with urgency. Bodies pressed against the cold metal of the console, breath fogging in the chilled air. There was no tenderness, only hunger, a frantic attempt to feel alive in a tomb of steel and silence. Afterward, they lay tangled on the floor, sweat cooling on their skin, the hum of the ship a faint pulse beneath them. Guilt crept in, but so did relief. For a moment the void receded, replaced by the heat of another's touch. They didn't speak of it. Not then, but the next night they found each other again, and the night after that, it became a ritual, a defiance against their fate. The command module, the crew quarters, the galley, every corner of the ship bore witness to their surrender. Each encounter was a battle against despair, a scream into the darkness that they were still here, still human. Yet the void was relentless. No matter how fiercely they clung to each other, it waited, patient and unyielding. Their supplies dwindled further, oxygen levels dropping, food reduced to crumbs. The ship's systems faltered, lights flickering like a dying heartbeat. Their bodies grew gaunt, their movements sluggish, but still they sought each other out, driven by a need that transcended survival. It was as if they could fuck their way out of oblivion, as if passion could rewrite the laws of physics that had stranded them. By March 20, 2025, they were shadows of themselves. Elena's once fierce eyes were hollow, Liam's hands unsteady as they traced her skin. They sat in the command module, staring at the stars through the cracked viewport. The rations were gone, the oxygen thinning with every breath. They'd stopped repairing, stopped pretending. There was only them, and the void, and the fading echo of their defiance. They held each other, not with urgency now, but with a quiet resignation, waiting for the end to claim them as it had their crewmates. The spark they'd kindled had burned bright, but even it couldn't outshine the infinite dark. The malfunction had been worsening for weeks aboard the Aurora Vanguard, a creeping decay that gnawed at the ship's systems with relentless precision. It started subtly, an intermittent flicker in the lights, a stutter in the oxygen recyclers, but by March 20, 2025, 9 months after the catastrophic failure of the Eclipton drive, the situation had grown dire. One by one, the ship's vital functions faltered. The power grid sputtered, plunging corridors into shadow. The water purifiers groaned, producing less with each cycle, and the thermal controls wavered, letting a chill seep into the metal walls. Alex Carter and Elena Vasquez, the last survivors of a 6-person crew, knew the clock was ticking. If they didn't act soon, their fragile lifeline would snap, leaving them to suffocate or freeze in the endless void. The problem traced back to the external array, a cluster of panels and conduits mounted on the ship's hull, responsible for regulating power distribution and oxygen flow. Diagnostics showed a short circuit, likely caused by micrometeorite damage, or the initial shockwave from the Eclipton drive's overload. Fixing it meant a spacewalk, a perilous task under ideal conditions, let alone with a ship on the brink of collapse. Elena volunteered without hesitation, her voice cutting through the hum of the command module where they'd been poring over flickering screens. I'll go, she said, her tone firm, brooking no argument. I've done EVAs before. I can handle it. Alex's jaw tightened, his hands pausing over the console. He wanted to go with her, to share the risk, but she shook her head before he could protest. Stay here, she insisted, her dark eyes locking with his. I need you to monitor the systems from inside. If something goes wrong out there, you'll be my lifeline. You can reroute power. Adjust the pressure, talk me through it. Her logic was sound, but it didn't ease the knot in his chest. He was an engineer, trained to fix things with his hands, not sit helplessly inside while she faced the void alone. He relented, though every instinct screamed against it. Fine, he muttered, rising to help her into her extravehicular suit. The suit was a bulky, white exoskeleton, its surface cuffed and patched from months of use, equipped with a helmet, oxygen pack, and a web of tubes and seals. He guided her arms into the sleeves, his fingers brushing her shoulders as he checked the connections. Each clasp, each seam, each valve, the fabric rustled under his touch, and he lingered a moment longer than necessary, feeling the warmth of her beneath the layers. Be careful, he said, his voice low, rough with an emotion he couldn't name. Their months together, 9 long desperate months of survival and stolen intimacy, had forged a bond words couldn't capture. She nodded, her helmet still under her arm, her gaze meeting his. In the dim light of the airlock prep room, her eyes held something he couldn't decipher. A flicker of resolve, yes, but also a shadow of something deeper, something that made his chest tighten with unease. Was it fear? Regret? Before he could ask, before he could press her to stay, she turned away, slipping the helmet on with a click that echoed in the small space. She stepped into the airlock, her boots clanging against the metal floor, and the inner door hissed shut behind her with a finality that left him alone. Alex hurried to the observation deck, a circular chamber with a wide viewport overlooking the ship's hull. He pressed himself against the glass, his breath fogging briefly before dissipating in the cold air. Outside, Elena emerged from the outer hatch, her figure tethered to the ship by a thin umbilical line. She floated with a grace born of training, her movements deliberate as she propelled herself toward the damaged array, 100 meters along the hull. The stars framed her, cold and unblinking, their light glinting off her suit's reflective patches. She was small against the vastness of space, fragile despite her strength, and Alex's hands clenched into fists as he watched her work. Through the comms, her voice crackled into his headset, steady despite the static. I'm at the array, looks worse than I thought. Half the conduits are fried. He could see her hands moving quickly, wielding a plasma cutter and a set of micro-tools from her belt, sparks flaring briefly in the vacuum. I'll try rerouting the power lines first, she said, her breath audible as she worked. Alex monitored the internal systems, his eyes darting between the viewport and the console beside him, its screen displaying jagged graphs of power flow and oxygen levels. Keep me posted, he replied, his voice tight. If the pressure drops, I'll compensate from here. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. Elena's updates came in clipped bursts, cutting the secondary line now, patching the relay, and Alex adjusted the internal controls, diverting what little power remained to stabilize her work. She was halfway through, the tangle of wires floating around her like a halo when it happened. He saw it before she did, a glint in the periphery of the viewport. A piece of debris hurtling toward her at incredible speed. It was small, no bigger than a fist, but in the vacuum of space, its velocity made it a bullet. Elena, move, he shouted into the comms, his voice raw with panic. She didn't have time to react. The debris struck her side, a silent impact that sent her spinning away from the hull, her tools scattering into the void. Alex, she screamed, her voice piercing the static, thick with terror and pain. Her umbilical line snapped taut, then frayed under the force, strands unraveling as she tumbled further from the ship. Alex lunged for the console, slamming his hands against the controls, but the thrusters offline since the initial malfunction, refused to respond. Hold on, he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. I'm coming. He raced to the airlock, yanking his own suit from its rack, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the seals. Through the comms, her gasps filled his ears, ragged and fading. Alex. I can't, she managed, her words cut off by a choking sound. He stumbled back to the viewport, suit half on, and saw her drifting further, her body a limp silhouette against the stars. The line had snapped completely, and without thrusters, the ship couldn't maneuver to reach her. He pounded the glass, a wordless roar tearing from his throat, but she was already too far. 50 meters, then 100, her figure shrinking to a speck. "Elena, stay with me," he pleaded, but the comms went silent, the static swallowing her last breath. He sank to his knees, the suit's helmet slipping from his grasp to clatter against the floor. Through the viewport, he watched her fade, her form swallowed by the infinite black, until she was gone, a star extinguished among countless others. The ship's beeping resumed, a cruel reminder of his solitude, and Alex stared into the void, his chest hollow, knowing he'd failed her when she'd needed him most. Liam Carter was alone. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, a visceral punch to the gut that stole the air from his lungs, and left him gasping in the sterile silence of the Aurora Vanguard. For months, he and Elena Vasquez had clung to each other, their shared defiance against the void, a fragile lifeline in the wreckage of their failed mission. They had been part of a team of 6, sent 9 months earlier to test the revolutionary Eclipton drive, a propulsion system meant to catapult humanity into the stars. But the experiment had gone horribly wrong, a blinding flash of light erasing their crewmates and stranding them in the endless black. Together they'd fought to survive, rationing supplies, repairing what they could, and eventually surrendering to a desperate, primal connection that dulled the edge of their despair. Now she was gone, and the weight of that truth left him reeling. He'd always known solitude was a risk in space. The training manuals had warned of it, pages of psychological protocols drilled into them during countless simulations, but those warnings had been abstract, hypothetical scenarios he'd dismissed with the arrogance of someone who'd never truly faced the abyss. He'd believed in Elena's strength, her unyielding resolve, the way she'd held them together when the ship's systems began to fail, and hope slipped through their fingers like sand. He'd believed in them, in the unspoken pact they'd forged through stolen touches and fevered nights. Not her, not them. The possibility of losing her had never felt real until now. The days after her death blurred into a haze of grief and disbelief. Liam drifted through the ship like a ghost, his movements mechanical, his mind numb. He barely ate, the last of their rations, Krabber protein bars and packets of rehydrated mush. Sitting untouched in the galley, sleep eluded him, his bunk a cold, empty reminder of the warmth she'd once brought to it. He tried to keep busy, to fill the silence with purpose. He ran diagnostics on the ship's faltering systems, the screens flickering with error codes he no longer had the will to decipher. He checked the oxygen recyclers, their heme growing weaker each day, and adjusted the water purifiers that gurgled pitifully as they strained to produce a trickle of potable liquid. It was all a distraction, a futile attempt to outrun the truth. Without Elena, the Aurora Vanguard was a lifeless husk, a metal coffin adrift in the void. Her death had been sudden, merciless. It happened on March 18, 2025, 2 days before he found himself alone. They'd been in the command module, reviewing the last of their dwindling resources, when she'd clutched her chest, her face contorting in pain. "Liam," she'd gasped, her voice a ragged whisper, before collapsing. He'd caught her, his hands trembling as he lowered her to the floor, shouting her name into the unresponsive air. The ship's medical bay, stripped of most of its supplies months ago, offered little help, a defibrillator with a dead battery, a scanner that beeped uselessly. He'd performed CPR until his arms ached, his pleas echoing off the walls, but her pulse never returned. A heart attack, he guessed later, brought on by stress, malnutrition, the relentless toll of their exile. He'd carried her body to the airlock, tears streaking his face as he released her into the void, a final act of love in a place that offered no grave. The ship felt different without her. The narrow corridors, once alive with their shared footsteps, now stretched into an endless maze of shadows. The command module, where they'd spent hours plotting impossible escapes, was a tomb of blinking lights and cold metal. Even the crew quarters, where they'd surrendered to their need night after night, seemed to mock him with its emptiness. Her scent lingered faintly on the sheets, a mix of sweat and the synthetic soap they'd rationed, fading with each passing hour. He avoided that room, sleeping instead on the galley floor, curled beside the table where they'd once brushed hands and ignited their fragile spark. On March 20th, 2025, he found it. He'd been clearing the galley, a mindless task to keep his hands occupied, when he noticed the waste bin tucked beneath the counter. It was a small, cylindrical unit, its contents a chaotic pile of discarded ration packets, torn wrappers and bits of wire from their failed repairs. He hadn't emptied it in weeks. There'd been no point, but something compelled him to dig through it now, a restless urge he couldn't explain. His fingers brushed against something hard amidst the debris, and he pulled it free, frowning at the unfamiliar shape. It was a small plastic stick, no longer than his palm, its surface scuffed and stained. At first, he didn't recognize it, his mind sluggish with exhaustion. But as he turned it over, squinting at the tiny window on its side, the realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. It was a pregnancy test. And it was positive. 2 pink lines stared back at him, stark and undeniable, a silent scream in the dim light of the galley. His hands trembled as he clutched the stick, his breath catching in his throat. Elena had been pregnant. She'd been carrying his child. The truth sank into him, heavy and sharp, piercing through the fog of his grief. They'd never discussed it, never even considered the possibility. Their nights together had been about survival. A desperate grasp at life in the face of death, not creation. Yet here was proof, tangible and cruel, that something had taken root in the midst of their despair. He staggered back, the test slipping from his fingers to clatter against the floor. His knees buckled, and he sank beside it, his chest heaving as the weight of it crushed him. She'd denned, or had she? Had she suspected, kept it hidden, unsure how to tell him in their fragile state, or had it been a secret even from herself, discovered too late to matter? The questions swirled unanswered, each one a fresh wound. He pressed his hands to his face, fingers digging into his skin, and let out a sound that was part sob, part scream, a raw, guttural cry that echoed through the empty ship. He'd lost her. He'd lost them both. The hours that followed were a descent into chaos. Liam sat on the galley floor, the pregnancy test resting beside him, its lines a mocking reminder of what could have been. His mind replayed every moment with Loveland, searching for signs he'd missed. Had her exhaustion been more than malnutrition? Her quiet moments, when she'd stared into the void, a hand resting absently on her stomach, had they meant something deeper? He cursed himself for not noticing, for not asking, for not protecting her when she'd needed him most. The ship's medical logs, corrupted after the Eclipton drive's failure, offered no answers. The scanner in the medbay might have detected it, but its power cells were long dead. Another casualty of their slow decline. He thought of the child, his child, a life that had flickered briefly in the dark, conceived in the heat of their desperation. What would it have been like? A boy with Elena's fierce eyes, a girl with his stubborn streak. He imagined holding it, a tiny heartbeat against his chest, a piece of them defying the void. The fantasy was fleeting, shattered by the reality of their situation. Even if Elena had lived, the ship couldn't have sustained 3. Oxygen was already a luxury, food a memory. The child would have been born into a death sentence. Just as they were. The isolation deepened, a chasm that swallowed him whole. He was truly alone now, the last survivor of a mission that had promised glory and delivered ruin. The Aurora Vanguard drifted on, its systems failing 111, the lights dimming to a sickly yellow, the air growing thin and stale. Liam stopped checking the diagnostics, stopped rationing the last scraps of food. What was the point? He wandered the ship aimlessly, his footsteps a hollow rhythm in the silence. He lingered in the command module, staring at the stars through the cracked viewport, their cold light a mirror to his emptiness. The pregnancy test stayed with him, tucked into the pocket of his jumpsuit, a talisman of loss. He pulled it out sometimes, tracing the lines with his thumb, as if he could will them back to Lee. He spoke to Elena in the quiet, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Why didn't you tell me?" he'd whisper. "Or I would have done better, for you, for us." The words hung unanswered, swallowed by the ship's hum. He wondered if she'd known at the end, if her final gasp had been for him or for the life she carried. The uncertainty gnawed at him, a wound that wouldn't heal. Days stretched into an endless night. Liam's body weakened, his frame gaunt from hunger, his skin pale and stretched over bones that ached with every move. The oxygen levels dropped, each breath a shallow struggle. He sat in the crew quarters, the test in his lap, and closed his eyes, imagining Elena beside him, her hand in his, their child a distant dream. The ship's systems groaned, a final protest before silence claimed them. He didn't fight it, he let the void take him, slow fade into the dark, joining her and the life they'd lost, adrift among the stars forever. Liam Carter sat alone on the observation deck of the Aurora Vanguard, the last remnant of a mission that had once promised to redefine humanity's place in the cosmos. The stars outside the reinforced viewport burned cold and distant, their light filtering through the cracked glass in faint, jagged patterns. 9 months ago, on that first night after the catastrophic failure of the Eclipton drive, those same stars had shimmered with a quiet allure, a backdrop to the crew's cautious optimism. He remembered Elena Vasquez standing beside him then, her silhouette sharp against the glow, her voice steady as she traced constellations with her finger and murmured about the worlds they might one day reach. That night, the stars had been a symbol of possibility. Now they offered no comfort, only a stark, unfeeling reminder of the vast, uncaring universe that had stripped everything from him. The observation deck was a small, circular chamber at the ship's apex, its walls lined with panels that once displayed telemetry data but now flickered with static or sat dark, their circuits fried beyond repair. A single chair, bolted to the floor, faced the viewport, a wide, curved window that spanned the room's width, offering an unobstructed view of the void. Liam slouched in it, his gaunt frame swallowed by the worn fabric of his jumpsuit, its patches frayed from months of wear. His hands rested limply in his lap, the pregnancy test he'd found days earlier clutched loosely in his fingers. The 2 pink lines stared up at him, a silent accusation, a relic of a future that would never be. The air was thin, each breath a shallow rasp against the failing oxygen recyclers, and the temperature had dropped, leaving a faint sheen of frost on the metal floor. The ship was dying, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it gave out completely. But he had lost her. Elena, his anchor, his commander, his lover, gone in an instant, felled by a heart attack 2 days prior, on March 18, 2025. He'd watched her collapse in the command module, her strong hands clutching her chest, her dark eyes wide with a fear he'd never seen in her before. He'd tried to save her, his palms bruising her sternum with desperate compressions, his voice breaking as he begged her to stay. But the ship's medical bay, stripped bare over months of scavenging, had offered nothing. No epinephrine, no functioning defibrillator, just a scanner that beeped uselessly as her pulse faded. He'd carried her to the airlock, his arms trembling under her weight, and released her into the void, her body drifting away until it was swallowed by the dark. With her went their child, a life he'd only discovered after her death, confirmed by the test he'd found buried in the galley's waste bin. The loss was a double wound, a blade that cut deeper with every breath. Without them, there was nothing left. The Aurora Vanguard, once a marvel of engineering, was now a husk, its systems failing one by one. The propulsion system, the Eclipton drive, had been their hope, a revolutionary design meant to warp space-time and propel them to Mars in hours. Its catastrophic overload 9 months ago had killed 4 of their crewmates, Priya, Marcus, Isha, and Julian. Leaving Liam and Elena stranded, they'd fought to survive, rationing food, patching leaks, and clinging to each other in the night. Their connection had been raw, born of desperation, a defiance against the isolation that threatened to unravel them. Now alone, Liam felt the absence, like a physical ache, a hollow space where her presence had once filled the ship with purpose. The void called to him, its silence a siren song that whispered through the cracks in the viewport. He stared out at it, the endless expanse of black punctuated by those cold, indifferent stars. The airlock was just down the corridor, a short walk, a simple button press, and he could end it. He imagined stepping out, the rush of decompression pulling him into the vacuum, his body tumbling weightless among the debris of their failed mission. It would be quick, painless, a surrender to the inevitable. The idea lingered, seductive in its simplicity, a way to escape the grief that gnawed at his bones. He'd even stood at the airlock once, hours after letting Elena go, his hand hovering over the controls, the hum of the ship's failing systems, a faint pulse in his ears. It would be so easy, but he couldn't do it. Not yet, because even in the depths of his despair, a small, stubborn part of him still clung to hope. It was faint, a flicker buried beneath layers of loss, but it refused to die. Hope that somehow, some way, he would find a way to survive, not just for himself, but for her, for the child they'd never know. Hope that he could honor Elena's memory, keep her alive in some small, tangible way, even if it was only through the act of enduring. She'd been a fighter, a woman who'd stared down every challenge with a fire he'd envied. To give up now felt like a betrayal of everything she'd been, everything they'd shared. And so he stayed. He stayed and he waited, the stars burning on outside, indifferent to his pain, the void stretching out before him, endless and eternal. The days that followed were a slow unraveling. Liam remained on the observation deck, rarely leaving except to check the ship's dwindling resources. The galley held the last of their rations, a handful of protein bars, their wrappers crinkled and faded, and a single pouch of rehydrated vegetables that tasted of dust. He ate sparingly, breaking the bars into crumbs and letting them dissolve on his tongue, stretching each morsel as far as it would go. Water was scarcer, the purifiers groaning as they extracted trickles from the ship's recycling system. He sipped it from a dented metal cup, the liquid tepid and faintly metallic, rationing it with the precision of a man who knew every drop was borrowed time. The ship's systems deteriorated around him. The oxygen recyclers, once a steady hum, now stuttered, their filters clogged with months of overuse. The air grew stale, heavy with the scent of wet and decay. And Liam's breaths came shorter, his head throbbing with the onset of hypoxia. The lights flickered, casting the observation deck in a sickly yellow glow that danced across the walls like a dying flame. The temperature controls had failed days ago, the heat leaching out into space, leaving the deck frigid. Frost crept up the viewport's edges, delicate tendrils that caught the starlight and glittered mockingly. He pulled his jumpsuit tighter, its insulation worn thin, and tucked his hands into his sleeves, the pregnancy test still a constant weight in his pocket. Memories of Elena haunted him. He saw her in every corner of the ship, the command module, where she'd stood with her arms crossed, barking orders with a confidence that steadied them all. The crew quarters where she'd pressed herself against him, her breath hot against his neck. The galley where their hands had brushed and sparked the connection that kept them sane. He replayed their final moments obsessively, her gasp, her collapse, the way her fingers had twitched as he'd tried to bring her back. Had she known about the baby? Had she felt it, a secret growing inside her, and chosen silence to spare him the burden? The pregnancy test offered no answers, its plastic casing cold against his skin when he pulled it out to stare at it, tracing the lines with a trembling thumb. He spoke to her sometimes, his voice a hoarse whisper in the silence. "You should have told me," he'd say, leaning his head back against the chair. "I could have done something. Betting. Or what were we going to name it? Something strong, like you." The words felt futile, swallowed by the ship's emptiness, but they kept her close, a tether to the life they'd built in the wreckage. He imagined their child, a girl with Elena's fierce eyes, dark and unyielding, or a boy with his own stubborn streak, hands destined to tinker with machines. The fantasy was a lifeline, fragile but persistent, a reason to keep breathing when every instinct urged him to stop. The void outside remained unchanging, its vastness a mirror to his isolation. The stars burned with a cold brilliance, their light unsoftened by atmosphere, sharp enough to cut. He traced constellations he'd learned in training. Orion, Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper, names that felt meaningless now, relics of a world he'd never see again. The Aurora Vanguard drifted aimlessly, its trajectory lost after the Eclipton drive's failure, a speck adrift in an ocean of nothing. He wondered where Elena's body was now, tumbling through the dark, her final resting place unmarked and unknown. The thought tightened his chest, a fresh wave of grief that left him clutching the armrests, his knuckles white. He considered survival, what it would take to stretch his time. The ship's logs, corrupted beyond repair, offered no hope of contacting Earth. No distress signal, no coordinates to guide a rescue that would never come. The remaining systems were a patchwork of jury-rigged fixes, their lifespan measured in days, maybe hours. He could cannibalize parts, reroute power from non-essential areas, the entertainment console, long silent, or the lab's dead microscopes. But it would only delay the inevitable. Oxygen was the bottleneck, its levels dropping with every cycle, his vision blurring at the edges as the air thinned. Food would run out soon, then water, and then it would be over, whether he chose the airlock or not. Yet that flicker of hope persisted, irrational and fierce. It drove him to act, to move when despair begged him to stay still. He left the observation deck, his steps unsteady, and shuffled to the command module. The room was a graveyard of blinking lights and shattered screens, the air thick with the smell of burnt wiring. He powered up the main console, its hum weak but steady, and ran a diagnostic not for repair but for memory. He typed a log entry, his fingers slow on the keys. March 28, gone. Child lost. Systems failing. I'm still here. It was a testament, a mark to prove they'd existed, that she'd mattered. He saved it, the screen flickering as the power wavered, and leaned back, exhaustion pulling at him. Back on the observation deck, he sat again, the pregnancy test in his hand. The stars burned on, their indifference a constant. He thought of opening the airlock, of joining Elena in the void. But the hope held him back, not for rescue, not for survival, but for her. To endure was to carry her with him, to keep their story alive in the silence. He stayed and he waited, his breath fogging in the cold, the void stretching out before him, endless and eternal, as the ship's heartbeat slowed to a whisper.